So hi everyone, welcome. We're so happy that you're here. I'm Malika. I'm a Chinese herbal medicine practitioner. I also practice Qigong and bodywork, meditation and craniosacral therapy. I'm based in Norfolk in the UK, and I have a special interest with mental health and well-being, and with women's health and also recovery after long illness. Laurie?
Hey, I'm Laurie Glenn, and I am a Chinese herbal practitioner, as well as an acupuncturist and a Reiki practitioner. And I work in the Richmond area, so close to London, but a nice, quiet little place where I see a lot of different things, but have a big passion for anxiety and depression that I focus on, and women's health as well as obviously, like a lot of us, treating this lovely thing called long COVID, which is what brings me here tonight.
Hi, I'm Martin John. I'm a Chinese medicine practitioner based in Frome in Somerset. I've been practicing now for 13 years. And I mainly focus on, or my main interests are lecturing on digestive diseases. I have a particular interest on the microbiome and how Chinese medicine affects the microbiome. And also lecture on digestive diseases like IBS and ulcerative colitis and Crohn's, and those sorts of conditions. But I have a broad interest in treating all sorts of conditions. So that's my background. I studied in Australia and then moved back to this country, and now practice in Frome.
Thank you, Martin. I just thought I'd kick off by giving some of these stats about long COVID. It's devastating. You know, when the pandemic first started, I think as practitioners, we all had a little in the back of our mind about what about afterwards, when, you know, inevitably at some point, hopefully it's all going to die down, but there's going to be a lot of, you know, the after, you know, post-viral syndrome, basically. And it's absolutely right. There's 2.1 million people in the UK which are currently suffering from long COVID. This is from the ONS. And so that's actually 3.3% of the whole population. And of those people, 12%, they had been ill with COVID in the previous 12 weeks, but 83%, it had been over 12 weeks that they've been ill. 50% of those people, so that's 1 million people, have been struggling with this for over a year. And it just makes me emotional, like, and 24% is over 2 years. So this is people day in, day out, still living with this. And I just, you know, I find this such a hopeful thing to do. It's like, you have not been forgotten. We're still working at it. We're still looking at ways to help people. And I mean, a large percentage of those people, 73%, said it really negatively affects their day-to-day activities, with about, I think, 17% severely affected their day-to-day. And the main experiences that people are having, they've got fatigue, brain fog, shortness of breath, and muscle ache. And just in terms of how it's affecting the UK population, it's a prevalence of quite a wide age range of between 35 to 69. Most of those are female, living in deprived areas and working in social care, and then also those with another activity limiting health condition or disability. So just on a kind of a human level of just imagining, there are 2 million people out there who are needing help, they need attention, and, you know, 50% of them is over a year. And yeah, I just think there's just so many people out there who really do need help.
It's amazing. That's quite the statistic. So I think to bring that to the table, something that we all have in common is that we work together on the Jade Screen project, which was started by a group of practitioners who, when this whole thing hit, were like, how do we help? What do we do? So we did this project where it began with research, as some of you know, where we looked at what are people doing? How are they going to use Chinese medicine to treat this population? Because we knew we were going to see it, but we didn't know what we were going to see. So the Jade Screen project was started to treat frontline workers with Chinese herbs. So there was some prevention work in there, there was active treatment in there, and then there was the after treatment. And obviously that's where we are now. So with Jade Screen, we got this real understanding of what this mix of symptoms was going to be. We had 367 applicants, with 315 of them actually being people we could treat. And of that, we had 56 practitioners who were out there treating this day in and day out and collecting this data so we could see this is what's happening right now and what we're seeing and how we could all work together to really treat this. And I think one of the shocking things coming out of that now, all of these years later, is I can speak for quite a few of those practitioners, is that we, of those 56 practitioners, some of us are still seeing some of those people. We're still treating them that have this long COVID. Or we get people in the door and they go, oh, I've had this, this, and this. And we just know, we go, you have long COVID, you know? So we know we're still seeing these new things coming in the door. And I think Jade Screen was the grounding to get us in there.
We've all been involved with that process, haven't we, from the start? So it was quite a journey during the pandemic, because A, it was something new, and B, there was a lot of issues with communicating the fact that we were treating long COVID for the start, because it was poorly understood. There was a lot of restriction against saying we treated COVID, full stop.
Yeah.
No one really knew how to treat COVID. And it sort of brings us round to the fact that Chinese medicine has been treating epidemics for 2,000 years, right? So there's a deep understanding in the texts and the classic texts about how to treat viral epidemics. So if there is a body of knowledge out there, Chinese medicine is a treasure trove. And really, right from the start, lots of practitioners were talking about, how could we apply this knowledge about treating epidemics to treat COVID? Because essentially it's no different to any other epidemic. It's particularly virulent. It wasn't, there was obviously lots of people dying in the first waves of COVID, and it affected the elderly more than the young. But there was still a need to find effective treatments.
Right.
And so there was, it soon became very politicized, didn't it? So the whole issue of, how can one say that we can treat COVID became politicized, and there was censorship and all sorts. But that's kind of a little bit of a different route to go down that. So maybe that's too much for tonight. But just to say that right from the start, some of these traditional formulas were being used, right? So we were thinking that, okay, well, this is the presentation of patients that are coming through the door, certainly after they've been suffering from COVID. We weren't seeing acute COVID cases because people were isolating. So that was the slight difference, wasn't it? We were having to look at the post-viral sequelae of infection straight away, because people weren't recovering and they were struggling for maybe weeks or months afterwards. So we were starting to see those long COVID patients quite early on, as soon as we were able to practice.
Yeah. And trying to crack that code of why you're getting it and you're not. And I think I remember panicking at the beginning, like to the point where my family was like, you're being crazy militant. And I was like, oh my gosh, I am. And then all of a sudden I had this moment where I was like, lean into your medicine. It has been here such a long time. And we were watching this unfold as a team, like, look at all of this, look what we have. And we shared this globally. And it's really powerful to go, okay, this is what we have. We've got this toolbox from thousands of years to get us, to support through it, even though we're not allowed to say so much. We know what we know, and we know what we've seen.
Yeah. And I think that was the beauty of it for me personally. And I've heard this shared with other colleagues as well, is that with our medicine, we treat what we see. So one person would come in with COVID or not come in with COVID, but, need help with recovery after COVID, or would be telling me they have COVID and they'd have this set of symptoms. And it's like, well, it's all called COVID, but actually this person's presenting with this, that person's presenting something very, very different, but it's at a similar time. So instead of, I did actually go into the first freak out mode of, I don't know what to do, working with colleagues, having groups of practitioners who were people who I really admire and trust, and working together and sharing that knowledge, and then just really treating each presentation that came into clinic as to what is exactly going on for them right now. And then that would change in a few days. So then I would change their formula. And we did start noticing that a lot of us were using similar herbs. So it's really useful to share that knowledge. But again, it's a bespoke formula for each person, for where they're at with the disease at the time. And I noticed that for people who did take herbs during and afterwards, it seemed that in general, people seem to recover more quickly. They seem to go through the motions of the disease more quickly than people who came, you know, several weeks after they'd been ill. And I mean, obviously I could still treat them, but it was just that sometimes they'd got stuck in a certain part of the disease pattern, and then with the herbs it helped them, the disease to like unravel and then, you know, come to a conclusion. So it was really amazing working with a group of people, sharing experiences, sharing treatment principles with each other, and learning what were the commonalities, and then also the bespoke nature of the treatment for each person.
Yeah, I think it's worth saying, isn't it, that Chinese medicine, because there's a different group, there's lots of different groups of people who this video is aimed at. So there's not just practitioners on this call, there's obviously members of the public and patients and people whose friends and families may have been involved. So you know, it's worth saying that Chinese medicine differs very much from a Western approach in that there's no one size fits all. You know, we're looking at each individual, how they present, and also there's a distinct understanding about how viral pathogens enter the body and how they progress and how the body responds. So even though the language is slightly different and we talk in metaphors like, you know, heat and cold and damp and those sorts of things, it's actually describing the same kind of processes as we now understand physiologically in modern science and modern medicine, though it's just coined in slightly different terminology. So that understanding, like you say, has been 2,000 years in the coming. And so there's a repeatable set of principles that we apply to dealing with a viral pathogen. And that goes for treating something acutely. And many of our patients were being given acute formulas which they could take at home when they were isolating, for instance, that you know would have helped. I mean, I was lucky enough, I count myself lucky enough to have actually got the first round of COVID in March 2020 after coming back from India. So I was lucky enough to be able to treat myself directly with the herbal formulas that I had to hand. And that helped me massively. You know, I had 2 or 3 days, it was uncomfortable and I got through it okay. And so, you know, we were giving our patients the ability to self-treat if they did come down with COVID, which most people inevitably did come into contact with COVID at some point. And I think that's continued over the 2 or 3 years, or 2 years of the main pandemic, and now the tail end this last year, where we could argue that the pandemic is almost over. But of course, we've got the second pandemic of long COVID that's still being felt. I think this is probably a good time to talk about the different management styles of how patients manage an acute viral attack. We call it a pathogenic attack, don't we? A pathogenic invasion. And there's the concept of what do you do to help yourself if you come down with something. It could be a cold, it could be a flu, it could be COVID. The management doesn't actually differ that much between those three. I mean, you know, it's interesting how we communicate that to our patients, because it is a different lifestyle advice that we give to patients, how they deal with acute respiratory disease.
Yeah, and especially I think people will come in, and I'm sure a lot of people hear this, or this is a conversation, is I've got these symptoms, which everybody says is COVID, but I'm not testing positive for COVID, or I don't think I have COVID. And in our world, when you talk to them, like, well, it doesn't matter, because while it does matter, we're going to treat you for what we see. And I think that's, you know, speaking to the evolution of how this has evolved over the last few years, and presentation and changing as people have learned how to better manage the preventative side of it as well. So of course that's going to change how they present to us, isn't it?
Absolutely. And I think some of the over-the-counter medicines actually go counter to the advice that we give. So things like paracetamol, for instance, you know, people are almost all cold and flu formulas have paracetamol to reduce fever and treat headache specifically. So for COVID in the first few days, headache was of course a key symptom. So that may have been appropriate to use those kind of paracetamol based preparations, but essentially a fever's there for a reason, isn't it? So it's the natural immune response, raising the body temperature to raise an immune response that tackles the virus. So in suppressing that, actually it's been shown that you extend the period of both the illness and also the communicable nature of it, and spreading it to others is actually increased by having paracetamol.
Yeah.
So it's amazing how how many people reach for the paracetamol even if they don't have a headache, because it's just programmed into us that a cold and flu take paracetamol.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
there was a time when I had just couldn't get the herbs in time for a client, and I was like, right, well, what have you got in your cupboard? Like, have you got fresh ginger? Have you got spring onions? Have you got a little bit of lemon but not too much? Have you got any dates? And so it was, the fresh ginger and dates is like the core dynamic of one of the main formulas, that a classical formula, Shao Chai Hu Tang, that has been used for centuries, and yet there it is in someone's cupboard. I know it's not all of the herbs in the formula, but it's that dynamic of a little bit of nourishing inside and then to get things out. So you've got the fresh ginger and the dates. And I was like, it will taste disgusting, but please, would you just take it? It's gonna and they were like, what, spring onions and dates? I was like, just believe me, just do it. Boil it up. And it was great. So they took that for a couple of days until I could get them the herbs. And so it was just really nice that they had something in their cupboard to support, what the more complex thing that I was going to get them. But in the meantime, they had that thing right to hand.
Yeah.
Well, people can always do something themselves, can't they? So
yeah.
There's really easy little hacks that we quite often teach our patients about. Spring onions is a classic example, isn't it? We want to bring on a sweat when we come down with a chill or a fever. Then bringing on a sweat is actually beneficial, because in Chinese medicine it vents the pathogen outwards rather than suppressing it, which actually encourages the pathogen to go deeper into the body. So it's those little things that can make a huge difference to recovery. And so education is key. So there's certainly different aspects of how Chinese medicine treats acute disease. But what about, I think, coming on to, it's worth mentioning at this point that we are sort of treating this fairly superficially at the moment, because we're trying to give a background, and there'll be a lot more detail in the longer talk. We haven't got time to go into the formulas that we use and the detail of the pathophysiology of long COVID and COVID. Because there simply isn't time tonight. So, but it's worth mentioning, what we think as practitioners be interesting in your views, Laurie and Malika, about who are the types of patients that are that we see that are more susceptible to long COVID, for instance.
Yeah.
It's a tricky one, isn't it? Because I've seen all age ranges, and I think that's the one that you're always surprised when, someone comes in the door. Like, I'm treating someone who has long COVID who's 28 and busy lifestyle, and all of a sudden, they've gone backwards. And then you have someone who's in their 70s and they're like, I'm through it, I'm fine. So you never know. I think that's the tricky part, is you never know who you're going to get. I'm always surprised in the door.
Yeah. And I think for people who've had a really active lifestyle, really athletic, it's that moment at the end of the illness where they're like, oh, I'm back, I've got my energy. It's always this thing of, please don't go full tilt yet. Just take it. You have another at least 3 or 4 weeks of actual recovery.
Yeah.
Please don't, spike your cardiovascular in that time. Please take it easy, because it's the amount of people who've come and said, I was feeling fine. I went out, I started running again. I was feeling great and it was so nice. And then boom, and they're then flat again. And it's like, well, your body was still in that, would you say, slightly inflammatory state. The immune system was still doing its clear up job. And then, then they have a little bit of a longer time of needing support with herbs and really gentle exercise to get them back into their flow again.
Absolutely. And it's now been, fairly well understood that in acute COVID, on day 7 or 8, quite often people do start to feel better before that. And then day 7 or 8 is the real danger time, where you can get this inflammatory response that is then exacerbated by activity, which can lead to a cytokine storm and can lead to all sorts of issues. And that, I think, is one of the reasons why, if you look on the long COVID groups, for instance, or talk to people who have suffered from long COVID, many of them, they have got the same story. I was perfectly fit and healthy before. I was going to the gym 5 times a week. And then they have an illness which they can't go to the gym for a week, so they feel that they really want to get back to exercise, and they go back too early, and then this is what causes this rampant inflammatory response that levels them. And once that immune system's been unbalanced like that, a lot of them don't recover very well at all.
Yeah.
So I think that's one of the key issues for not everyone. Of course, everyone's got a different path, you know, and I think one of the other key things is that background inflammatory conditions like diabetes, obesity, any autoimmunity, those kind of things, that inflammation is generally higher in the body, they're more likely to possibly get that inflammatory response that lingers on beyond a normal time frame of a viral illness. And so yeah, there's lots of other things, I mean, to do with the microbiome. I don't know whether we've got time, but another thing that I noticed early on, and I did an informal poll in one of the groups, and it looked like there was a strong correlation between people at the start of the pandemic who were given antibiotics. Because at the start of the pandemic, no one knew how to treat COVID. So one of the key things, if people did present to hospital, was that they were trying to prevent people coming down with COVID pneumonia, which is a secondary infection, you know, in the latter stages of the disease. So people were given antibiotics as a routine sometimes to try and prevent that. And that, of course, you know, decimates your bacteria in your gut. And we know that most of our immune system, 70%, is actually based in the gut and is reliant on the bacteria to work properly. So I'm sure that, you know, that leads people to be more susceptible to having these lingering effects after COVID. So we'll go into more of that, you know, on the long lecture, but it's an interesting field.
I think that'll be great. And I think that's something we talked about before when we went on tonight, is to have people understand the role of Chinese herbs with that, because I think a lot of times, you know, there's all this research out there about the gut. And so a lot more people are going to see nutritionists and, you know, taking probiotics and understanding prebiotics. And I think that's great. But when we talk about Chinese medicine, we don't always give people a fair understanding of how does it work, to understand that there's a probiotic component to what we're doing, and we're using those herbs and in a beautiful symmetry to help rebuild that microbiome, so that flora that we need to fight COVID specifically is there, you know, to really boost the immune system, and understand that that's how we're coming at it as well, even if we don't talk about it like that.
And also the role of herbs in helping the body doing its clear up job, because sometimes if there's a lot of post-viral debris hanging around in the system, it could be in the interstitial tissues, could be in the gut, is to be able to clear that so that it can clear out, so the body can do its restoring job. Because sometimes with some heavy tonic herbs, if the system's clogged up and it doesn't get cleared, then actually it can really dampen things down. So you've got the mutual benefit of, you know, doing some clearing plus tonifying as well, to help people in this process of recovery.
Yeah, and it's worth mentioning, I think, that a lot of the herbal formulas that are used during viral or treatment of viral upper respiratory diseases, and in the sequelae, or the sort of lingering effects afterwards, a lot of the formulas in themselves, that many of them have got, you know, a mixture of 8, 10, 12 herbs. Some of them are slightly smaller, but they're a synergistic blend of herbs that work to treat different areas of the condition. So one formula may well, a lot of them are, both anti-inflammatory, they're antiviral, antibacterial, and sometimes also stop viral entry into cells. So it kind of has a multifunctional approach, the formulas that have been developed over these many years, and that's why they're so effective. It isn't just one herb, take this one herb and this is good to boost your immune system. We don't talk that way in Chinese medicine, do we? So we look at the pattern and we think, okay, well, there are these aspects that need support, and there are these pathogenic factors which need clearing, and we can do them both at the same time with these very clever formulas that have been developed over many years. And that was the basis of, you know, the formula that was developed in China, which is now being researched. I think the research is almost ready to be published in the States. There's a combination of 4 or 5 traditional formulas in one big formula. It is a bit of a scattergun approach, but it combines these formulas that have these distinct pharmacological actions that are great to prevent the progression of viral disease. And they showed in China that it cut hospital deaths by 50%, which is the same or greater than most of the Western medications that were being tried at the time. So it's just that Chinese medicine doesn't have the research budget behind it to give these massive trials, and obviously there's no money in natural herbs as much as developing a new drug, which will make a lot of shareholders happy in some of the larger pharmaceutical companies.
Yeah.
So, but, just to say that, yes, the researchers were using those in China, but, all of us practitioners were using those formulas in our clinics throughout the pandemic, with great success, it has to be said. Sure, there are times when they don't work as well as we hope, and it's not a magic bullet by any means, but it's just a different way of looking at the condition, which has a great history of understanding behind it.
Yeah.
That I find so appealing, and certainly long COVID is not an easy nut to crack by any means, but there's a lot to learn from the treasure trove of Chinese medicine to draw on.
Well, and I think that's one of the things that's going to be really beneficial. And one of the big questions people are always asking me is about that spike protein. So hearing you talk more in depth about that is going to be great to understand. Do we all have that spike protein when we get COVID, or did you have it when you get vaccinated, which is something you're going to talk about, and how herbs come into play with that? And, I think the whole lifestyle aspect of where we come in as practitioners versus Western medicine. And that's not to say we don't need Western medicine and whatnot, but it's to look at that whole picture of it, to say, like you said, you're not going to go run a marathon when you're starting to feel better on day 7, because we understand inflammation in the body, and we understand what it's like when you get this, and here's the lifestyle along with the herbs or whatever else it may be to keep people getting themselves well, which sometimes they want that to be a week, and it's 6 months or longer,
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I think it's also a really key time, because there were a few months ago I was thinking, well, is there much role for developing an understanding of this, because we're at the tail end of a pandemic? But we're not really. I mean, it's becoming endemic, and the vaccinations, whilst they may have provided some benefit, one could argue, for some people in the first couple of waves, they've now shown that against the newer strains like Omicron, they're very, very ineffective. So people are continuing to get COVID, regardless of their vaccination status. And so there is a need for people to be able to know how to look after themselves in their own home when they come down with something acutely, which most people don't. Most people don't look after themselves well enough to recover quickly.
Right.
And also what to do if you've got a lingering cough, lingering fatigue, all those things that are potentially lingering issues after a viral pathogen event, which COVID really, it's this post-viral thing. It's just post-viral fatigue, post-viral issues, regardless of whether it's called long COVID or not. And it's a school of thought in Chinese medicine, isn't it? This lingering pathogen, which has been studied for hundreds of years, if not thousands of years. So there's it's not new. It's not new. And I think in some regard, because there's similarities between chronic fatigue and ME, for instance, and also things like post-viral fatigue in general, there is a bit more of an acknowledgement that those people who are suffering from those conditions, it isn't all in the head. And there are sometimes physiological reasons why people can't get better. And we're not saying we have all the answers, but it's a different take on how to treat those kind of conditions as well, because there is an overlap.
Yeah, it is an overlap. And I think it's a different way of differentiating symptoms that gives us a broader understanding of, oh, I never felt like this until I had COVID, but obviously then they go, but I've been taking antibiotics for 15 years for something else. And it's like, okay, how do we work through that? And how do we, give you the right lifestyle and herbs to get to both of those things, to really rebuild you in a different way, which I think is really exciting about what we offer.
Yeah. And I think also with the lifestyle, sometimes the herbs can do a certain amount, but actually what that person also needs to do is, focus on downregulating their nervous system, or they need to take an activity that brings more joy into their lives, or they need to learn a different body work modality like yoga or Tai Chi, and having all these other things in the toolkit is, I found, really useful when I felt, the herbs can take you so far. Actually, what you need now is some acupuncture or a shiatsu, or and also, especially, I don't know if you guys have found this, but in terms of recovery, I found it's often quite cyclical. So people will spiral out of it, and then there'll be a pause, and something will be, it just feels like they've plateaued, or they've got slightly worse. And I've found that as like a healing crisis to then actually spring up to the next spiral. But it can be really upsetting and dispiriting to have this what feels like a pause in their recovery. And sometimes what's helped that is just, you know, going back to the drawing board, looking at a brand new set of herbs for them, or they've actually needed a physical treatment or something else that has helped them to go into the next phase of treatment. Because for some people it's not, I mean, I have had somebody who it just took a week, and then I've had people it's taken 8 months. And so, you know, it's all very different presentations and different recovery, but knowing that we've got these other things in our toolkit, I find, yeah, it brings me hope.
I agree. And to just remind people, because we talked about this a lot with Jade screen practitioners, that you'd see people, they crash and then they get better, and then they crash and they get better. But what we never saw was them going back to that original crash. So there's a lot of that support to say, I know you've plateaued, but you're not going to go back here. You're going to keep going. I mean, you can't guarantee that to people, but it's not what we were seeing. So you know, we're going to in increments, and instead of, you know, when you get it, I think when people originally got it, they were like, I'm going to fight this. So they want to get back out there and they want to go. And it's just saying, we're going to take a different, gentle approach to this, because it's the way to get through it, really.
Yeah.
I think the feedback from the Jade Screen project was testament in itself. I mean, some of the comments we got from patients that were treated under the Jade Screen project were hugely gratifying, that they were helped so much by that. And some of them were completely, you know, they're very skeptical at the start when patients, you know, start coming to a Chinese medicine practitioner or starting herbs. They're told that, you know, there's nothing that can be done for a condition like long COVID, and so there's not really a placebo effect, because they're quite often very skeptical. They say, oh, this isn't going to work, may as well give it a go. And sometimes they're amazed at the difference it makes. I mean, I was fortunate enough to have my first patient, long COVID patient, was miraculous. It was similar to Malika. It was three weeks, and she got her life back. And so, you know, I can't say that for all the patients that I've treated by any means, but yeah, there's a lot of very, very good success stories, and I think the Jade Screen project was a fantastic initiative for that, actually, because a lot was learned.
Yeah. Well, I'm excited to.
Yeah. But you know, we're gonna go into this in quite a bit of detail in the longer talk, which I believe is on the 20th, isn't it? 20th of April.
20th of April, yeah. I've just put the link there in the chat for everybody.
So we will be talking about you know, the traditional formulas that have been used, the approach the Jade Screen project took, or many of the approaches that were taken, some of the key herbs that have got an effect on spike protein, for instance, and ACE2 receptors, and all that sort of stuff. And then we'll also be talking about the microbiome, because there's a lot of stuff there now that's very interesting about how microbiome affects both viral progression and also the effects of microbiome on the effectiveness of vaccines, for instance. So there's interesting stuff in there, and hopefully it'll give a broad account of Chinese medicine's approach to treating long COVID, and also spike protein damage, which we are seeing because people are being repeatedly exposed to spike protein, whether it's through natural infection or whether it's through vaccination. It's still repeat exposure to something that causes ongoing inflammation. So there's a fair bit to be discussed there as well. So I'm really looking forward to it. I hope you can make it.
Yeah, that'd be great. I'm excited to be there. I made it sound like I might or might not come. I might. Yeah,
You're definitely going to be there, Laurie.
Totally it.
I'm going to be asking some serious questions if you're not there.
I know, right? Very exciting. Very exciting.
Well, thank you both. It's been such a lovely evening, and thank you to everyone who came along. I've just noticed somebody's very kindly pointed out the date is wrong on the website. It is definitely the 20th of April next month coming up, and I'll update that. So yeah, look forward to seeing anyone and everybody who'd like to come along. That would be great.
Yeah, thank you, everybody.
Thanks, everyone. Lovely to talk to you.
Yeah.